funny thing about humiliation, Emily Carter once heard someone say, it only works when the person being humiliated still cares about the people watching. The rooftop of the Meridian Tower glittered under a warm Manhattan night, music floating through the open air as glasses clinked and quiet laughter drifted between small circles of well-dressed guests. The kind of party where every watch looked expensive and every conversation sounded like it might end with a business deal worth millions. Emily stood near the edge of the terrace, the cool breeze brushing lightly against the simple navy dress she had chosen that evening, a dress elegant enough to belong but modest enough not to compete with the shimmering gowns around her, and for a moment she watched the city lights stretching for miles beyond the glass railing, yellow taxis threading through the streets like tiny sparks of movement far below. No one noticed her at first, which was exactly how she had expected it to be. Most of the people here had never met her before, and those who had once known her had already decided she was someone whose chapter had ended years ago. Then the music shifted, the crowd parted slightly, and Ryan Carter finally saw her. His smile paused mid-conversation, his eyebrows lifting with a kind of amused disbelief, the same look he used to give when something entertained him just enough to keep the room's attention. Ryan adjusted the cuff of his charcoal suit and slowly walked toward her, a glass of champagne balanced easily in his hand as several guests turned to see what had captured his interest. Well, he said loudly enough that nearby conversations faded, if this isn't a surprise. The guests nearest them glanced between the two of them, curious smiles forming as Ryan gestured casually in Emily's direction. Ladies and gentlemen, he continued with the polished charm that had helped him climb so quickly through New York's business circles. Meet Emily. My ex-wife. The word lingered in the air just long enough for a few people to murmur politely. Ryan's girlfriend Olivia Grant stepped closer, her silver heels clicking softly against the stone floor as she studied Emily from head to toe with a faint smile that never quite reached her eyes. I didn't realize you were coming tonight, Olivia said lightly, though the tone carried the soft edge of someone who had expected exactly this moment. Emily met her gaze calmly. I received the invitation. Ryan chuckled, turning slightly so more people could hear him. Technically it wasn't an invitation, he corrected, lifting his glass. It was more like curiosity. A few quiet laughs rippled through the nearby crowd. You see, Ryan added with theatrical patience, Emily used to think she belonged in rooms like this. Back when we were married. Someone behind him whispered something that made another guest grin. The city wind moved gently through the terrace again, carrying the faint scent of citrus from the bar, and the distant hum of traffic far below. Emily didn't react. She simply rested her hands lightly together in front of her, and watched Ryan with the same calm expression she had worn since arriving. Olivia tilted her head. You're looking comfortable, she said, glancing briefly at the dress. Simple suits you. Ryan raised his glass again. Come on, Emily, he said, smiling in that polished way that once made investors trust him instantly. Don't stand there all quiet. Tell everyone what you've been doing these days. The crowd leaned subtly closer, curiosity sharpening the air. Emily let the silence sit for a moment, just long enough for Ryan to assume he had already won the exchange. Then she spoke, her voice soft but steady. Living. Ryan laughed louder this time, shaking his head as if that answer confirmed every opinion he had ever shared about her. Still mysterious, he said. Still dramatic. Another round of polite laughter followed. Yet while the guests watched the small spectacle unfold, Emily's eyes drifted briefly toward the elevator doors across the terrace, where a quiet chime sounded almost unnoticed beneath the music, and for the first time that evening, the corner of her lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. Ryan Carter enjoyed an audience, and the small circle forming around him now gave him exactly that. The rooftop lights reflected in the glass walls of the Meridian Tower, casting warm gold across polished shoes and designer jackets while the city stretched endlessly beneath them, a quiet reminder of the wealth and ambition that had brought most of these people together tonight. Ryan swirled the champagne in his glass with effortless confidence, clearly pleased with the attention he had drawn. You know, he continued, glancing toward the guests who had leaned closer to listen, Emily always had this incredible talent for believing life would somehow just work out for her. A few people smiled politely. Olivia rested one hand lightly on Ryan's arm as though supporting the story. She had dreams, Ryan added with a soft laugh. Big ones. But dreams do not exactly pay Manhattan rent. Another ripple of quiet laughter passed through the group. Emily stood exactly where she had been since the conversation began, the breeze gently moving a strand of dark hair near her cheek while the faint music from the party floated through the air behind her. Her expression did not change. Ryan seemed almost disappointed by that calm. He took a small sip from his glass and continued, clearly enjoying the role of storyteller. "Do not misunderstand me," he said, lifting a hand slightly as though offering a fair warning. "Emily is not a bad person. She is just unrealistic." Someone nearby murmured something that sounded like agreement. Olivia tilted her head with a sympathetic smile that did not quite hide the curiosity in her eyes. "It must be strange for you to see all of this again," she said softly, gesturing toward the glowing skyline and the expensive gathering around them. "This world moves very quickly." Emily followed Olivia's gesture for a moment, her eyes drifting across the glittering towers of Manhattan, the distant lights reflecting along the dark ribbon of the Hudson River far below. When she looked back, her voice remained calm. "Yes," she said quietly. "It does." Ryan leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice just enough to feel personal while still loud enough for the nearby guests to hear. "So tell us honestly," he said, smiling with a kind of curiosity that carried a sharp edge beneath it. "What brought you here tonight?" The question hung in the air. For a moment the music seemed softer, the breeze cooler against the terrace. Several people waited with the subtle anticipation of those expecting an awkward answer. Emily folded her hands lightly together, her posture relaxed, as if she were standing in a quiet park instead of the center of a crowded rooftop party. "I was invited," she replied simply. Olivia let out a small amused breath. "That is technically true," she admitted. Ryan chuckled again, glancing around at the watching guests. "But you have to admit," he said, "it takes confidence to show up somewhere. You clearly do not belong anymore." This time the laughter was a little louder. Someone near the bar lifted a phone slightly, pretending to check a message while quietly recording the scene. Emily noticed the movement but did not react. Her gaze shifted briefly once more toward the elevator doors across the terrace. The polished metal panels reflected the warm lights of the party while guests moved casually in front of them, unaware of the quiet tension building in the space between conversations. Ryan followed her glance and smirked. "Looking for an exit already?" he asked. Emily turned back to him, her expression still calm, her voice steady enough that those closest could hear every word. "No," she said gently. "I am waiting." Ryan raised one eyebrow. "Waiting for what?" The soft chime of the elevator sounded again in the distance, almost lost beneath the music and laughter of the party, but Emily heard it clearly, and this time her faint smile returned as the doors slowly began to open. The elevator door slid open with a quiet metallic whisper that almost disappeared beneath the music, but something in the shift of the air made a few guests near the terrace glance in that direction. Emily Carter did not move. Her eyes were already there, steady and calm, as a tall figure stepped out onto the rooftop. The man walked with an unhurried confidence that did not need to demand attention in order to receive it. His black suit was sharply tailored, the kind that fit with the quiet precision of custom craftsmanship, and the city lights reflected softly across the polished leather of his shoes as he crossed the terrace. For a moment the crowd continued their conversations unaware. Then someone near the bar froze mid-sentence. Another guest turned fully toward the elevator. A whisper began to travel across the party like a ripple moving through still water. Ryan Carter noticed the change first in the silence spreading behind him. He frowned slightly and followed the direction of several guests' gazes. Olivia did the same, her smile fading as she tried to understand why the energy of the room had suddenly shifted. The man continued walking across the rooftop with measured steps, his posture relaxed yet unmistakably commanding. A few people stepped aside without realizing they had done so, creating a natural path through the gathering crowd. One of the investors standing near Ryan leaned toward another guest and murmured something under his breath. The name traveled quickly from one person to the next. Alexander Hayes. The reaction was immediate. Even those who had only seen him in financial magazines or business interviews recognized him now. Alexander Hayes was the kind of name that carried weight in New York boardrooms. A technology investor whose decisions could reshape entire companies. A man whose presence at any event instantly raised the value of the room itself. Ryan blinked once, confused by the sudden attention shifting away from him. "What is everyone staring at?" he asked, turning slightly as the whispers grew louder. Olivia looked again toward the approaching figure, her expression tightening as recognition settled across her face. "Ryan," she said quietly, her voice losing its earlier confidence, "that is Alexander Hayes." Ryan gave a short, incredulous laugh. "That is impossible," he replied automatically, though his eyes had already locked onto the approaching man. Meanwhile, Emily remained exactly where she had been standing since the beginning of the conversation, the city wind brushing softly across the terrace while the tension around her continued to rise. Alexander Hayes reached the final few steps between them and stopped beside her as naturally as if they had planned to meet there all evening. For a brief moment the rooftop fell almost completely silent except for the distant music. Alexander turned slightly toward Emily, his expression warm but composed. "I apologize for being late," he said in a calm voice that carried easily through the still air. "Traffic leaving Midtown was worse than usual tonight." Emily looked up at him, the faint smile returning to her lips as though the evening had finally begun to make sense. "You are right on time," she answered gently. Alexander placed one hand lightly at the small of her back in a gesture so natural that it seemed practiced through years of quiet familiarity. Then his gaze lifted toward Ryan Carter and the stunned circle of guests surrounding him. Ryan's confident smile had disappeared completely now, replaced by a stiff expression that struggled to process what he was seeing. For the first time that evening he had no clever remark ready. Emily turned slightly toward him, her voice calm and steady as the watching crowd waited for her next words. "Ryan," she said softly, "I would like you to meet my husband." For several long seconds no one on the rooftop spoke. The quiet that followed Emily's words felt heavier than the laughter that had filled the terrace only minutes earlier. Ryan Carter stared at the man standing beside her as if the scene in front of him had somehow been staged for someone else's amusement. The name Alexander Hayes still moved through the crowd in low whispers, repeated by guests who suddenly seemed very aware that the balance of attention in the room had shifted completely. Ryan forced a short laugh that sounded thinner than he intended. "That is quite a joke," he said, lifting his glass slightly as though this were all part of the entertainment. But Alexander Hayes did not laugh. He simply extended his hand with the calm politeness of someone accustomed to formal introductions. "Ryan Carter," he said evenly, his voice steady and professional. "I have heard your name mentioned a few times tonight." Ryan hesitated for a fraction of a second before shaking the offered hand. The grip was firm but brief. Olivia stood beside Ryan with a tight expression she could not quite hide, glancing between Emily and Alexander as if searching for some explanation that would restore the evening to the way it had been only moments earlier. "You are married?" she asked, the surprise in her voice more obvious than she probably intended. Emily nodded slightly, her posture still relaxed despite the circle of curious guests surrounding them. "We are," she said calmly. Alexander glanced toward her with a quiet smile that softened the sharp lines of his composed demeanor. 2 years this fall," he added. The reaction around them grew louder now. A few guests stepped closer, recognizing the opportunity to greet one of the most influential investors in the city. Others watched Ryan carefully, curious to see how the host of the evening would respond now that the story he had been telling about his former wife no longer seemed quite so simple. Ryan cleared his throat and straightened his jacket. "Well," he said slowly, attempting to recover the confidence that had slipped from his voice earlier, "that is certainly unexpected." Emily looked at him with the same calm expression she had maintained since arriving. The warm wind moved gently across the terrace again, carrying the soft hum of Manhattan traffic from more than 30 stories below. "Life can be surprising," she replied. Ryan glanced toward Alexander once more, studying him carefully now. "And how exactly did the two of you meet?" he asked, the question sounding casual but carrying the sharp curiosity of someone who was no longer entirely comfortable. Alexander answered without hesitation. "Through work," he said. "Emily and I collaborated on a project a few years ago." Several guests exchanged looks at that. The idea that Emily Carter had been working anywhere within Alexander Hayes' professional world clearly did not match the quiet narrative Ryan had been building about her only minutes earlier. Olivia folded her arms lightly and tilted her head. What kind of project? She asked. Emily turned slightly toward the city lights again before answering, as if the memory itself belonged to another chapter of her life. A small consulting job at the beginning, she said. It grew from there. Ryan studied her face carefully, noticing for the first time that the calm confidence in her eyes did not resemble the uncertain woman he believed he had known years ago. Around them the rooftop party slowly resumed its movement, though the conversations now revolved around the unexpected arrival that had transformed the evening. And as Ryan stood there trying to understand how the situation had changed so quickly, Emily Carter simply looked out across the glowing skyline with the quiet composure of someone who had never been lost in this world at all. Ryan Carter had spent years mastering the art of controlling a room, but standing beneath the warm lights of the Meridian Tower rooftop, he could feel that control slipping through his fingers in quiet, uncomfortable pieces. Conversations had resumed around the terrace, yet they carried a different energy now, a softer tone filled with curiosity and speculation. Guests who had been laughing at Ryan's story earlier were now glancing toward Emily Carter, and the man beside her with open interest. Alexander Hayes did not appear to notice the attention. He stood calmly at Emily's side, one hand resting loosely in his pocket while he observed the skyline as though the glittering stretch of Manhattan was simply another familiar view in a long list of remarkable places. Ryan cleared his throat again, determined not to let the shift in atmosphere become obvious. Well, he said with a measured smile, this is certainly an impressive reunion. Emily turned slightly toward him, her expression composed, neither defensive nor proud. It has been a long time, she replied. Olivia watched the exchange carefully, the polite smile on her face now tighter than before. She had expected tonight to be a simple moment of social entertainment, a chance to remind everyone how completely Ryan had moved on from his former marriage. Instead, the story had taken a direction no one had planned. You never mentioned you were married again, Olivia said, addressing Emily but glancing briefly toward Alexander as she spoke. Emily folded her hands lightly in front of her. There was never a reason to, she answered. Ryan forced a small laugh that did not quite reach his eyes. That is an interesting way to put it, he said, considering how small this city can be. Alexander finally looked toward Ryan again, his expression polite but thoughtful. New York is large enough for people to build entirely new lives if they choose, he said calmly. The statement was simple, yet several nearby guests exchanged quiet looks as if the meaning carried more weight than the words themselves. Ryan shifted his stance slightly, trying to regain the comfortable confidence he had worn earlier in the evening. So you said you met through work, he continued, directing the conversation back toward Emily. What kind of consulting project was it exactly? Emily glanced briefly toward the bar where a bartender was pouring fresh champagne for a pair of guests who kept looking back at their group. The city wind brushed gently across the terrace again, carrying the distant sound of a siren somewhere far below. It started as research, she explained, a small analysis project for a technology investment. Ryan raised one eyebrow with mild disbelief. Technology investment, he repeated slowly, as if the phrase sounded unusual coming from her. Alexander did not seem offended. Instead he nodded slightly. Emily has a remarkable ability to see patterns that most people overlook, he said. It proved valuable during a very important acquisition. Several people standing close enough to hear leaned in subtly at that. In Manhattan business circles, the phrase important acquisition often meant millions of dollars had quietly changed hands. Olivia crossed her arms gently, her curiosity now impossible to hide. You are telling me Emily helped with one of your deals? She asked. Alexander looked toward Emily again before answering. She did more than help, he said. She saw the opportunity before anyone else did. Ryan studied Emily carefully now, as though trying to reconcile the calm woman standing before him with the version of her he had once dismissed so easily. But Emily did not seem interested in explaining herself further. Instead, she simply turned her gaze back toward the endless lights of the city, her expression peaceful in a way that suggested the evening was unfolding exactly the way she had expected it to. Ryan Carter could feel the attention of the room shifting in ways he no longer controlled. The rooftop party had slowly regained its rhythm, Yet the center of gravity had moved away from him and toward the quiet conversation now forming around Emily Carter and Alexander Hayes. The skyline of Manhattan stretched endlessly behind them, windows glowing like thousands of small lanterns across the night, while a gentle breeze drifted through the open terrace. Ryan adjusted the sleeve of his jacket again, a small gesture meant to restore his composure. "Well," he said after a moment, forcing a confident tone back into his voice, "it sounds like Emily has been much busier than anyone realized." Emily glanced toward him with a calm expression that revealed nothing. "Life tends to become busy when people stop assuming what you are capable of," she replied softly. A few guests standing nearby exchanged subtle looks, sensing the quiet weight behind her words. Olivia shifted her stance slightly, studying Emily with open curiosity now rather than casual amusement. "It still surprises me," she admitted. "Ryan always described you as someone who preferred a quieter life." Emily's eyes moved briefly across the rooftop, taking in the soft glow of string lights above the bar, and the reflection of the city across the glass walls of the building. "I do prefer quiet," she said. "Quiet simply does not mean small." Alexander watched her with a faint smile that suggested he had heard that line before. Ryan cleared his throat, unwilling to let the conversation drift too far away from his control. "You mentioned a project," he said, turning toward Alexander again. "An acquisition." Alexander nodded slightly. "Yes." Ryan tilted his head. "Which company?" he asked, his voice casual but edged with the professional curiosity of a businessman who spent his life measuring opportunities. Alexander looked at him steadily. "At the time it was a mid-size software firm that most analysts overlooked," he explained. Emily reviewed the data and pointed out several patterns in the market that suggested the company was about to grow very quickly. A guest near the bar leaned closer, clearly interested now. "And you bought it?" the man asked. Alexander gave a small nod. "We invested early." Olivia blinked with surprise. "That must have been worth a fortune if the timing was right." Alexander did not answer immediately. Instead he looked toward Emily again, allowing her to respond if she wished. Emily rested her hands lightly against the glass railing, the lights of the city shimmering below her. "The company is now valued at a little over $3 billion, she said calmly. The quiet reaction from the nearby guests was immediate. Someone inhaled sharply while another person muttered a surprised remark under their breath. Ryan stared at her for a moment, the number clearly settling in his mind. $3 billion, he repeated slowly. Emily nodded once. That was only the first one. The breeze moved across the terrace again, carrying the distant sound of traffic from far below while the party lights reflected across the polished floor. Ryan studied her face carefully now, as though searching for signs that this was some elaborate exaggeration. But Emily's expression remained completely composed. Alexander glanced around the terrace as several investors quietly repositioned themselves closer to the conversation. Emily has a habit of noticing opportunities long before they become obvious, he said calmly. Ryan let out a slow breath and looked out across the glowing skyline of Manhattan. For the first time that evening, he seemed to understand that the story he had been telling about his former wife was no longer the only version of the truth in the room. The number lingered in the air like a quiet echo. $3 billion. Even though the music on the rooftop had resumed and the bartenders continued pouring champagne, the conversation near the glass railing had clearly become the center of the evening. Several investors who had been speaking across the terrace slowly drifted closer, pretending to refill their drinks or greet someone nearby, but their attention remained fixed on Emily Carter and the calm man standing beside her. Ryan Carter forced a polite smile, though it appeared slightly tighter now. That is quite an impressive result, he said carefully. But acquisitions like that usually involve entire teams of analysts. Emily nodded once as if she agreed with the logic. They do, she said. But sometimes a single observation changes the direction of the entire analysis. Olivia studied Emily's face with growing interest. Earlier in the evening she had expected to watch a simple social embarrassment unfold. Now the situation felt very different. So you predicted the company's growth before the market noticed it? She asked. Emily looked toward the skyline again, where the lights of Manhattan shimmered across the dark river beyond the buildings. Not exactly, she said calmly. I noticed something the market was ignoring. Alexander watched her with the same quiet confidence he had carried since arriving. Emily recognized that the company's software would soon become essential to several industries at the same time, he explained. Once that happened, the value would multiply very quickly. A man standing near the bar let out a low whistle of surprise. That kind of foresight is rare, he said. Ryan glanced at the guest, then back toward Emily. For the first time that evening he seemed uncertain how to respond. You never mentioned any of this before, he said slowly. Emily's gaze returned to him, calm and steady. You never asked. The answer was simple, yet several people nearby exchanged glances as if the meaning carried more weight than the words themselves. The wind moved across the rooftop again, lifting the corner of a linen tablecloth and carrying the distant sound of traffic through the night air. Ryan shifted his stance, attempting to regain the easy confidence he had shown earlier. Well, he said, $3 billion is certainly an impressive beginning. Alexander tilted his head slightly. It was not the end of the story, he said. Ryan frowned faintly. What do you mean? Alexander glanced toward Emily again, as if giving her the opportunity to answer first. She rested one hand lightly against the glass railing, while the city lights reflected in her eyes. The acquisition opened several new doors, she explained. Technology tends to grow in connected waves. Olivia leaned forward slightly. So you continued investing? Emily nodded once. Carefully. One of the investors listening nearby could not hide his curiosity any longer. Are you telling us that was only the first major deal? He asked. Emily did not appear interested in making the moment dramatic. She simply answered with the same quiet composure she had carried all evening. Yes. Ryan studied her expression again, noticing that the uncertainty he had once associated with her was completely gone. In its place was something far steadier, something that did not need approval from anyone in the room. Around them the rooftop party continued beneath the warm lights of the Meridian Tower, but the story unfolding beside the railing had already begun to rewrite the assumptions that many people present had quietly believed about Emily Carter. The quiet confirmation that it had only been the first deal settled across the small circle of listeners like a slow wave. The rooftop party around them continued with music, clinking glasses and polite laughter, yet the group near the glass railing had grown noticeably larger. Guests who had previously ignored Emily Carter now seemed eager to remain within hearing distance. Ryan Carter noticed the change as well. Only an hour earlier the attention of the evening had revolved around him and the business celebration he was hosting. Now the center of gravity had shifted toward the woman he once believed had disappeared quietly from his world. Ryan forced another measured smile. So you continued investing, he said, repeating the phrase as if testing its meaning. Emily nodded gently. Carefully, she replied again. Alexander Hayes rested one hand against the railing beside her, looking out across the glowing skyline as if the conversation unfolding behind him was simply another familiar business discussion. Olivia glanced between them, curiosity now fully replacing the earlier amusement she had shown when Emily first arrived. When you say carefully, Olivia asked, do you mean small investments or something larger? Emily considered the question for a moment while the breeze moved softly across the rooftop. The lights of passing traffic glimmered far below like tiny rivers of gold through the dark grid of Manhattan streets. Opportunity does not always announce itself loudly, she said. Sometimes it appears quietly in industries people believe they already understand. One of the investors standing nearby leaned forward slightly. Such as? He asked. Emily lifted her eyes toward him. Artificial intelligence infrastructure, she said calmly. 2 years before most major firms realized how quickly the demand would grow. The man blinked with clear interest. You invested before the boom? Emily nodded once. Alexander added gently. Emily identified several smaller companies building the foundation systems that larger corporations would soon depend on. Ryan let out a low breath. And those companies grew as well? He asked. Emily did not answer immediately. Instead she turned slightly toward the bar where a bartender was placing fresh glasses of sparkling water on a polished tray. The city lights reflected across the glass walls behind him like shifting constellations. When she finally spoke, her tone remained steady and simple. Two of them were later acquired by international technology firms, she said. The third expanded independently. Olivia's eyebrows lifted. That must have been worth an extraordinary amount. Emily shrugged lightly. It was successful. One of the guests listening nearby gave a soft laugh of disbelief. You are describing it very calmly for something that could change a person's entire life. Emily looked toward the skyline again. It did not change my life, she said quietly. It revealed the direction my life was already moving. Ryan studied her face with increasing concentration, the faint tension around his eyes betraying the calculations happening behind his calm expression. You make it sound effortless, he said. Emily shook her head gently. Nothing about it was effortless. Alexander looked at her with a knowing smile. Emily spent months studying markets most analysts ignored, he said. She simply saw possibilities earlier than others did. Around them the rooftop party continued beneath the warm lights of the Meridian Tower, but the quiet story unfolding beside the railing had already begun to reshape the way many people in the room viewed the woman Ryan Carter once believed had been left behind. The rooftop breeze moved gently through the gathering as the conversation around Emily Carter continued to draw quiet attention. What had begun as a simple celebration for Ryan Carter's latest business milestone had gradually turned into something else entirely. People who had once listened to Ryan's confident stories about success were now studying the calm woman standing beside the glass railing as though seeing her for the first time. Ryan noticed the shift clearly. His smile remained in place, but the ease behind it had faded. You make it sound like you discovered a completely different world, he said slowly. Emily looked toward the distant river where the city lights reflected across the dark water. I did not discover a different world, she replied. I discovered that the world is larger than the story someone else tells about you. The words settled quietly between them. Olivia folded her arms loosely, her curiosity no longer hidden. And all of this happened after the divorce? She asked. Emily nodded once. Most of it. Alexander Hayes glanced toward her with a thoughtful expression. The work started earlier, he said. Ryan's eyebrows lifted slightly. Earlier. Alexander continued in the same calm tone. Emily had already begun studying emerging markets, while she was still rebuilding her life. Ryan looked at Emily carefully now. Rebuilding, he repeated. Emily did not appear offended by the word. Instead she gave a small nod. Yes, she said. When everything familiar disappears, you learn quickly how much you can actually build on your own. A few guests listening nearby grew quiet again, sensing that the conversation had moved beyond business numbers and investments. Ryan shifted his stance and leaned lightly against the railing. You are saying that all of this success started from scratch? He asked. Emily's eyes moved across the skyline once more, the towers glowing against the dark sky like rows of quiet lanterns. Success rarely begins with comfort, she said. It usually begins with someone deciding they will no longer accept the limits other people place on them. Olivia watched her closely. That sounds like a difficult path. Emily smiled faintly. It was a long one. Alexander added gently. Emily spent more nights studying market data than most analysts working full-time. One of the investors standing nearby gave an impressed nod. That kind of dedication explains a lot, he said. Ryan remained silent for a moment, clearly measuring the information he had just heard. Earlier in the evening, he had believed he understood exactly who Emily Carter had become after their marriage ended. Now that picture seemed incomplete. So all those investments, he said finally, the acquisitions, the companies you identified, they were all built from that research? Emily turned back toward him. Yes. The music on the rooftop shifted to a slower rhythm as a new song began playing through the speakers. Around them the party continued with quiet conversations and laughter, but the group near the railing remained focused on Emily's story. Ryan looked out across Manhattan again, the glow of thousands of windows stretching far into the distance. For the first time that evening he seemed to recognize that the woman he had once dismissed as unrealistic had quietly built a future far larger than the assumptions he had once spoken about so confidently. The music drifting across the rooftop softened as the evening continued, but the quiet gravity of the conversation near the railing had not faded. If anything, the attention around Emily Carter had grown stronger. Several guests now stood close enough to listen openly, no longer pretending their interest was casual. Ryan Carter noticed every glance, every whisper that passed between the investors he had invited tonight. Earlier he had been the center of the celebration, the confident host presenting his latest venture to potential partners. Now the conversation had shifted somewhere he had not expected. Ryan rested his hand lightly against the glass railing, looking out across the glowing skyline before turning back toward Emily. "You have certainly built an impressive story," he said carefully. Emily met his gaze without tension. "It is not a story," she replied calmly. "It is simply the work I chose to do." Olivia studied her closely. "Most people would talk about that kind of success much more openly," she said. "You sound almost indifferent to it." Emily shook her head gently. "Success becomes quieter when you stop needing other people to believe it." The words carried a calm certainty that made several people in the group fall silent again. Alexander Hayes watched the exchange with the same composed patience he had maintained since arriving. He glanced briefly toward the bar where a waiter was arranging fresh glasses beneath the warm hanging lights. Then he returned his attention to Ryan. "Your event tonight seems to be celebrating a new investment," Alexander said politely. Ryan nodded once. "Yes. My firm is expanding into data infrastructure." One of the investors standing nearby added with enthusiasm, "Ryan believes the demand for large-scale processing systems will grow significantly over the next decade." Alexander listened thoughtfully. "That is a reasonable prediction," he said. Ryan lifted his glass slightly, regaining a hint of his earlier confidence. "It is the next big wave," he said. "We are positioning ourselves early." Emily's eyes shifted toward him again. The faint reflection of the city lights moved across the glass behind her. "Positioning early is important," she said. Ryan gave a short nod. "Exactly." For a brief moment neither of them spoke. The breeze moved through the terrace once more, stirring the edges of tablecloths and carrying the distant hum of traffic 30 floors below. Then Alexander spoke again, his voice calm but deliberate. "Which companies are you planning to acquire for the infrastructure build?" Ryan hesitated slightly. "We are still evaluating a few smaller firms," he answered. One of the investors added proudly, "Ryan believes the real value will come from consolidating the right platforms before larger corporations notice them." Emily listened quietly, her expression thoughtful. "Consolidation strategies can be effective," she said. Ryan glanced at her with a faint smile that carried a hint of challenge. "You sound like you have some experience with that." Emily's voice remained steady. "A little." Alexander rested his hand lightly against the railing again. "Emily actually reviewed several infrastructure companies earlier this year," he said. Ryan's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Did she?" he asked. Alexander nodded. "Yes. In fact, she recently completed an evaluation involving one of the firms that might interest your investors tonight." Several people in the group leaned slightly closer. Ryan looked from Alexander to Emily, curiosity now clearly replacing the earlier confidence in his eyes. "Which company would that be?" he asked. Emily did not answer immediately. Instead she looked out across the endless lights of Manhattan once more, as though measuring how much the evening had already changed since the moment she first stepped onto the rooftop. Ryan Carter waited for the answer with a calm expression that felt carefully constructed, yet the subtle tension around his eyes revealed how closely he was listening. Around them the small circle of investors and guests had grown even larger. Conversations from other parts of the rooftop had begun to drift toward this side of the terrace, as people sensed that something important was unfolding. The Manhattan skyline stretched endlessly behind the glass railing, towers glowing against the dark sky while the breeze carried the distant rhythm of traffic far below. Emily Carter remained quiet for a moment longer, her gaze resting on the lights of the city as though she were measuring the weight of the question Ryan had just asked. Olivia shifted slightly beside Ryan, clearly curious now in a way she had not expected to feel earlier that evening. "You said Emily evaluated a company connected to Ryan's plan," Olivia said, glancing toward Alexander Hayes. "Which company was it?" Alexander looked toward Emily again with the calm patience he had shown all night. It was clear he was allowing her to decide how much to reveal. Emily finally turned back toward the group. Her voice when she spoke was steady and calm. The company is called Northbridge Systems. A quiet murmur passed through several of the investors standing nearby. Ryan's expression changed immediately. Northbridge, he repeated. One of the men standing close to the bar straightened slightly. That is one of the firms Ryan has been considering acquiring for the infrastructure project, he said. Ryan nodded slowly, still studying Emily's face. Yes, he said. It is one of the most promising candidates. Emily rested one hand lightly against the glass railing. It is promising, she agreed. Olivia tilted her head, curiosity deepening. And you evaluated it recently? Emily nodded once. Several months ago. Ryan's voice remained calm, but there was a new focus in it now. And what was your conclusion? He asked. The breeze moved across the rooftop again, lifting the edge of a linen tablecloth nearby. For a brief moment the music seemed quieter, as if the entire terrace had begun to listen. Emily glanced briefly toward Alexander before answering. My conclusion was that the company had far greater potential than most analysts believed. One of the investors leaned forward slightly. That would make it an excellent acquisition for Ryan's firm, he said. Emily looked toward him. It would, she said gently. Ryan allowed himself a faint smile, clearly relieved by that response. Then perhaps we agree after all, he said. But Alexander spoke again before the moment could settle. Emily did not simply evaluate the company, he said calmly. Ryan turned toward him. What do you mean? Alexander's tone remained even, yet the words carried a quiet weight that immediately pulled the attention of everyone nearby. After completing her analysis, he explained, Emily decided to move forward with the opportunity herself. Ryan frowned slightly. Move forward how? Emily turned fully toward him now. The expression on her face was not triumphant or confrontational. It was simply calm, the same calm she had carried since she first stepped onto the rooftop earlier that evening. 3 months ago, she said softly, I finalized the acquisition of Northbridge Systems. For several seconds no one spoke. The words seemed to hang in the air above the terrace like a sudden shift in gravity. Ryan stared at her, clearly processing what she had just said. One of the investors finally broke the silence. With a stunned whisper, You bought the company? Emily gave a small nod. Yes. The city lights reflected in the glass railing behind her as the reality of the moment slowly settled across the group, gathered on the rooftop. For a long moment the only sound on the rooftop was the quiet hum of the city far below, and the distant music drifting through the warm night air. The words Emily Carter had spoken seemed to settle across the gathering like a sudden shift in gravity. Several of the investors standing nearby stared at her with open disbelief, as if they were still trying to understand whether they had heard correctly. Ryan Carter remained completely still, his gaze fixed on Emily's face. You acquired Northbridge Systems, he repeated slowly, each word measured as if speaking them aloud might somehow change their meaning. Emily nodded once. Yes. Olivia looked from Emily to Alexander Hayes and back again, her earlier confidence replaced by unmistakable astonishment. But that company was the cornerstone of Ryan's entire infrastructure plan, she said. He has been discussing it with investors for weeks. Emily's expression remained calm. I know. One of the men standing closest to the group spoke quietly, almost to himself. Northbridge is not a small acquisition. That deal must have been worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Alexander answered gently, his tone factual rather than dramatic. The final valuation was slightly higher than that. The murmur that followed spread through the nearby guests like a soft ripple. Ryan looked out across the skyline again, the glow of Manhattan's towers reflecting faintly in the glass railing beside him. When he turned back his voice was steady, though the confidence that once filled it had softened. Why did you not announce it publicly? He asked. Emily folded her hands lightly in front of her. Because the strategy required time. Olivia frowned slightly. Strategy for what? Emily looked toward the cluster of investors who had gathered around Ryan throughout the evening. Northbridge is more valuable when it remains independent for the next phase of development, she explained. Rushing the announcement would have complicated several negotiations already in progress. One of the investors listening closely spoke up with renewed interest. Negotiations with whom? Emily glanced briefly at Alexander before answering. Several international partners who are expanding their infrastructure capacity. The man nodded slowly, clearly impressed. Ryan studied her again, as though trying to reconcile the woman standing calmly before him with the version of her he had once believed he understood. So the company I have been planning to acquire, he said quietly, already belongs to you. Emily did not smile. She simply nodded again. Yes. The breeze moved across the rooftop once more, lifting the edge of a nearby tablecloth while the city lights shimmered across the glass walls of the Meridian Tower. Several guests shifted their weight, sensing that the balance of power in the conversation had changed completely. Ryan looked toward Alexander. You supported the acquisition? He asked. Alexander answered calmly. Emily made the decision. I simply believed in her analysis. The quiet confidence in his voice carried a respect that several investors in the group clearly noticed. Emily glanced once more across the endless lights of Manhattan before returning her gaze to Ryan. I did not come here tonight to compete with your plans, she said gently. I came because this city is large enough for many different futures. The words were not confrontational, yet they carried a quiet finality that settled over the rooftop gathering. Around them the party continued beneath the warm lights, but the story unfolding near the railing had already changed the way everyone present would remember this evening. The rooftop remained quiet for a few seconds after Emily Carter finished speaking, as though the night itself had paused to let her words settle. The breeze moved softly across the terrace, carrying the distant hum of Manhattan traffic 30 stories below while the golden lights of the city stretched endlessly into the dark horizon. Around the glass railing the small group of investors and guests stood in thoughtful silence, each person quietly absorbing the realization that the evening had turned into something far different from the simple celebration they had expected when they arrived. Ryan Carter looked out across the skyline, his reflection faintly visible in the glass beside him. Earlier that night he had stood in this same spot telling a story about the past, confident that the version of events he remembered was the only one that mattered. Now the view of the city seemed somehow larger, as if the horizon itself had shifted. After a moment he let out a slow breath and turned back toward Emily. You built all of this quietly, he said. Emily met his gaze with the same calm composure she had carried since she first stepped onto the rooftop. Quiet work often lasts longer, she replied. Olivia watched the exchange carefully, the curiosity in her expression now mixed with a certain respect she had not expected to feel earlier that evening. Several of the investors who had come to hear Ryan present his expansion plans now studied Emily with genuine interest, clearly reconsidering the possibilities of the future she had described. Alexander Hayes remained beside her, relaxed and steady, his presence calm rather than imposing. Ryan glanced briefly toward him. You believed in her before anyone else did, he said. Alexander gave a small nod. I believed in what she saw. The music on the rooftop shifted again as another song began drifting through the speakers, softer this time, blending with the quiet murmur of conversations beginning to return around the terrace. Ryan looked back at Emily one more time. For the first time that evening his voice carried no hint of the teasing confidence he had shown when she arrived. I suppose I misunderstood a great deal about the direction your life was taking, he said. Emily did not appear offended by the admission. Instead she offered a gentle smile that held neither pride nor resentment. People see what they expect to see, she said. The breeze lifted a strand of hair across her shoulder as the city lights reflected softly in her eyes. For a moment none of them spoke again. Then Alexander glanced toward the elevators across the terrace. We should let your guests enjoy the rest of the evening, he said politely. Emily nodded once. Before turning to leave she looked back toward Ryan, her voice quiet but clear enough for the small circle around them to hear. You once told me that I did not belong in rooms like this, she said gently. Ryan did not respond immediately. Emily's expression remained peaceful, almost reflective, as she looked once more across the endless skyline of New York. The truth is, she continued softly, I never needed the room. I only needed the future I was willing to build. With that she turned and walked beside Alexander toward the elevator, their steps unhurried beneath the warm rooftop lights. Behind them the conversations of the party slowly resumed, but the people who had witnessed the evening would remember the moment in silence long after the music faded. And as Ryan Carter stood watching the elevator doors close, one quiet realization settled in his mind with unmistakable clarity. Emily had never come back to prove him wrong. She had simply returned as the person she had become.